How's the day going? Great. I've heard good things.
It goes back on it.
This is going to be a great panel. You have two of the leading commentators on legal issues, on voting rights, on democracy, fully understood as democracy, not what you hear in the papers and every day. We didn't talk earlier, but this Elie, who's a major intellect, is also a major tweeter. And he was celebrating yesterday, but that's not, all right. Elie Mystal, I first met at one of these conferences, the last one, I think.
The last one we did in person.
Yeah, and he is the nation's Justice Correspondent and the host of its legal podcast, Contempt of Court. He's also an Alfred Nobler Fellow at the Type Media Center. His first book is the New York Times bestseller, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution, which educates and entertains about some of the greatest misconceptions of constitutional scholarship and the many travesties in the American justice system. On any given night, you can find Elie on your screen, your computer. He lives, I believe, at MSNBC, and he's a great, great commentator.
Unpaid. No.
We're honored to have him at The Nation. Ari Berman. I think Ari Berman was one of my first Nation interns. And I assigned Ari a piece. This is going to be ancient history. He had done some extraordinary work about the Iraq War in the media. And I asked him to go interview this guy who was like the hawk Cold Warrior of the time, Richard Pearl, one of the architects of the Iraq War. And Ari got the interview, but Mr. Pearl wanted money for the interview. And we had to have an ethics conversation. I gather Mr. Pearl went off to the south of France, a country he derided all the time, but he lived there. But Ari has become a major voice on the system, the voting system, the limits of democracy in this country. He started, as I said, as a Nation intern. He began one of the first blogs called The Daily Outrage. I'm not sure you could do it today. There would be like 20 outrages a day. He's the voting rights reporter for Mother Jones, a former senior contributing writer to The Nation, where he really began his work developing this beat of voting rights, of the suppression of voting. He is author of the new book, Minority Rule, The Right-Wing Attack on the Will of the People and the Fight to Resist It. So I'm going to start with Ari, if I could. Could you briefly, coming off of yesterday's verdict, 34 counts, talk about what worked and what is not working in this country in terms of the system? And
thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect.
And we're going to have questions.
Far from me to pass on the question, but the first person whose Twitter feed I checked when the verdict came out was Elie. So I think Elie should start,
Okay,
and because he was rattling off the best one-liners, and then I'll go after him.
Look, obviously, I was happy because anytime accountability can happen to even the richest, most powerful white men in the universe, that's a good day, right? I am a fan of accountability. But if you follow, I haven't actually covered the trial. I haven't written a lot of articles about the trial. I haven't been on TV about the trial a lot because I am at a phase in my own personal existence where I am at jail or GTFO, right? Put this dude in jail or leave me the hell alone. I don't have time for any more of these fines anymore, right? And that's the problem where I still see that we have, right? Like the accountability that Trump is getting through all of his legally required attempts at due process, which of course he should have, through all of the fairness that the system gives him, which of course he should have, is a fairness and a due process and a system that is not given to black people. Mm-hmm. That is not given, for the most part, to poor people of any race. Now, I'm not saying that I want Trump to be treated like a black man. That's mean, right? I don't wish that the justice system to treat my worst enemy, Sam Alito, as a black man, right? That's not nice. What I would like is to see black people risen up to the level where we could be treated like Donald Trump. Right? I would love to live in a world where every criminal defendant got the opportunity, the resources, the delay tactics that Donald Trump has gotten through the process. If we lived in that world, I would say that what's happening is fair. It's the delta between how Trump is being treated by this system and how everybody else is being treated by the system that pisses me off, right? So we start there in terms of just like what actually happened. The other thing, and then I'll throw it to you, that I can't help not knowing as I watch the verdict play out, as I watch the 34 counts play out, is that the people who are important in this country haven't voted yet. And people are going to think that I mean like, oh, because in November we've got, no. The 9 people who were allowed to be important in this country on the Supreme Court haven't voted yet. And I can't look at a 34 count conviction and know if Trump is going to, Trump didn't lose, Trump might have lost 34-0 in the indictment, but he still might win 6-3 in front of the Supreme Court. And because we have a system where Trump has gotten to pick his own judges, and those judges have shown a willingness to do whatever it takes to keep Trump out of jail, it's hard to get too excited about the verdict yesterday. It was good, I was happy, I was able to make some jokes. That was fun. I always like, tweaking the Republicans whenever I have an opportunity. Posting the number 34 every different kind of petty ass way that I can think of. That was fun. But in terms of like actually like moving our country forward, the important people haven't voted yet.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that only in America could you be the first president to ever be criminally convicted and lose the popular vote twice and still appoint a third of the Supreme Court, right? Like that's clearly like an only in America situation. And while the system worked in this case, just think about all the events that got us here. I mean, Trump is still going to be the Republican nominee for president, and he still has, at worst, a 50-50 shot of winning, and possibly quite better. And what more do we need to know?
He's the front runner.
Why does the criminal justice system need to render a verdict on someone we knew did all these things? That's the same thing that I feel with the insurrection, right? Would it be great if he was tried before the election on the insurrection and convicted? Like, absolutely. But we know he incited it. We don't need a court to tell us that. But just think of all the things that have factored into enabling Trump. Because one of the things that I write about a lot in my book is that the crisis we face is much bigger than Trump. And Trump can't do authoritarianism alone, right? So you look at the insurrection, right? The Senate had a chance to disqualify Trump from ever running again. That was the only chance there was to disqualify him from ever running again. And they chickened out. First off, they chickened out. A lot of people said, Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader at the time, deliberately said, we have to wait until after the election to try to impeach him. We have to wait till after the new Congress is sworn in to try to impeach him. And then he said, oh, it's too late to actually impeach him. Then you had 57 senators vote to convict him, 43 vote to acquit him. That was less than the 2/3 majority you need. But because of the structure of the US Senate, where each state, regardless of size, gets 2 senators, the 57 senators that voted to convict Trump represented 76.7 million more Americans than the 43 senators that voted to convict him. Meaning that more than senators representing not just a majority of Americans, but 80 million more Americans wanted to convict him. They didn't, okay? Then you get to the fact that the Supreme Court delayed the trial and looks at best likely to kick it back to lower courts, at best, right? If not, just give him qualified immunity. Well, that Supreme Court was constructed by a Supreme Court that for the first time in our history, you have Republican presidents that lost the popular vote, at least initially, and senators representing a minority of Americans confirmed those Supreme Court justices. So all the ways in which Trump is being protected right now shows how the system isn't working. And that, to me, is one of my biggest critiques. I know we're going to talk more about this, about how the media is covering this election, which is they're covering it as Biden versus Trump. And I get why that's happening. It's always a personality contest. But there's a lot less attention to the undemocratic system that produced Trump and how Trump could then make that undemocratic system so much more undemocratic if he gets into power again.
So please talk about the media, what it's not covering, but also the fact that the system, we've lived with the system there's an erosion. The legitimacy of the courts is now being questioned by Trump, but we've lived with filibuster, we've lived with electoral college, we've lived with these anti-democratic institutions for years. Trump has exposed how anti-democratic they are. But in terms of your coverage, your work as a journalist covering these issues, what would you tell people gathered here to focus on in these next months?
You go first.
Well, like I said, I would focus, this is my beat, so I'm not telling any of you guys what to focus on because there's so many issues that are out there that are important, real on-the-ground issues, day-to-day things that affect people's lives every single day. So I'm not saying don't focus on those things. What I am focused on is the structural inequities in the system, because I believe the structural inequities produce unfair outcomes. I believe there's a reason why we can't pass real criminal justice reform or common sense gun control laws or protect a woman's right to choose or give everyone the right to vote, because the system produces outcomes that are directly at odds with those kind of things, where even if a majority of people believe in these things, and 70 to 80% of Americans support things like reasonable gun control laws and protecting a woman's right to choose and better air and better water, but these things are blocked over and over by these structural inequities. And what I think we have is a really dangerous combination. We have these basically undemocratic institutions that were, both Elie and I write about this in our books, that were designed basically by a bunch of rich white men, many of whom were slaveholders, who more than anything else wanted to protect their own power when it came to drafting the Constitution. Yeah, they wanted democracy, but they wanted democracy on their terms, right? They didn't care about minority rights as we tend to think of them, historically disenfranchised communities. They didn't care about the rights of poor white people or African Americans or women or Native Americans. They were concerned with a very specific minority, which was wealthy white male landowners, and that's who they wanted to protect first and foremost. So we have these undemocratic systems, and because you have a situation where someone can lose the popular vote but win the electoral college, where you can win a majority in the Senate but represent fewer people, where you can gerrymander so that you can get fewer votes statewide but a majority of seats, that then leaves an opening for an authoritarian leader to exploit those cracks and go further. Because what Trump has done is he's layered on all these anti-democratic tactics on top of an anti-democratic system. But it's also much bigger than Trump. I started covering the issue of voting rights in 2011, years before Trump had ridden down the golden escalator and called Mexicans rapists and murderers. And the fact is, Republicans were doing all of these things at the state level. They were doing voter suppression, they were doing gerrymandering, they were rolling back rights for women, rolling back rights for labor. And if more people had focused on that, they would have realized the Republican Party began radicalizing against democracy well before Donald Trump. And it's precisely because the Republican Party had radicalized so much against democracy that there was an opening, an appetite for someone like Donald Trump. Because if the Republican Party was a normal party committed to democracy, they would have never looked for an authoritarian figure like Trump in the first place.
You don't get to 2016 without Bush v. Gore in 2010 and 2000, right? So, okay, safe space, just between us friends. I don't give a shit about flags. All right? I really don't give a crap that Alito is flying an upside-down flag. I don't give a crap that he's blaming his wife for it. I know it's not his wife's fault. His wife is crazy, but I don't care. I don't care. I think it's a silly story insofar as Sam Alito has been the most partisan pro-insurrectionist judge for his entire career on the Supreme Court bench. I didn't learn a damn thing from his insurrectionist flags. But I'm in journalism, but I'm in media, right? So from a journalism perspective, my thought was always, all right, how can I use this silly story about a flag that apparently everybody cares about now to actually talk about the important issues, right? About the things that I want to talk about, the things that I think people should know about. I was in our little panel, we were talking a little bit about how do you force people to eat their vegetables, right? And one of the things I said is that you can't force them to eat vegetables, you have to trick them. So how can I use this cotton candy story about the flag and trick people into thinking that they're reading about the flag, which they're, look at the flag, but actually give them the vegetables about, no, Alito's an asshole, and y'all need to know why, right? So that's kind of how I approach all of electoral silly season, right? There are going to be stories, there are going to be issues that come up that grab the media's attention that are objectively dumb. that are objectively not important, right? And my job, and this is an older person's perspective, because when I was younger, I was like, I will fight them, I will make them. I can't fight, I can't. If you want to talk about the dumb thing is what's going to be on TV, right? So I've understood now that my job is to transubstantiate the dumb thing into the thing that I actually want people to be talking about, right? And so with the flag, there are two aspects, right? And if you look at what I've actually been writing, there are two things. One, I was able to use the flag to do this entire kind of piece, it was a 3,000 word piece, about Alito's entire career and how that career shouldn't have happened but for the rejection of Harriet Miers, who also would have been terrible for different reasons. But like explaining kind of how she was rejected, the elitism inherent in rejecting this, frankly, quite dumb woman, but like, that's not why she was rejected. She was rejected for other, right? So I was able to explain this entire vegetable-filled backstory about Alito because people were interested in the flag, right? Second thing, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, I've been able to write about how terrible journalism is when it comes to the Supreme Court. Because how did the flag story even get out, right? This is a thing that he was flying 8 years ago. And people knew it 8 years ago, but just didn't tell us. If you go and look at there was a Washington Post story that they put out on the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend, which is this great, like, I am dumping this story. It's in the paper, I don't want anybody to actually read it, right? On a Saturday, of Memorial Day weekend, right? Where it says that the Washington Post reporter went to Alito's house, saw the flag, asked him about it. He was like, it was my wife's fault. He was like, okay. And didn't write about it. And I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? This, days after the election, literally the reporter went there on the day Joe Biden was inaugurated, saw the insurrectionist flag up at a Supreme Court justice's house, and was like, that's not news, because Alito said it wasn't news. That's the level of reporting that we have about the Supreme Court. We have people who understand themselves to be stenographers for the justices, who understand themselves as their job is to repeat what the justices tell them. Some of that is training. When you have non-lawyers reporting on the Supreme Court and the lawyers say like, well, we did it for this reason. If you don't have the training to know, well, that's not how the law works. You're kind of inclined to just be like, well, the smart guy said it was this, so it's probably this. And I'm just gonna repeat that. That's terrible journalism, but that happens all the time about the Supreme Court. And the second thing that you see is that there's an inherent latent respect for this institution that none of the other institutions of government get. The president does not get this level of respecting, and I think they used to.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Right, and then like,
Congress.
Then Nixon did some stuff that I'm vaguely aware of, and then I think there was Clinton, there was some kind of blowjob situation, and then all of a sudden we don't respect presidents anymore. Congress has never been respected. Like, reporters will hound congressmen, like where they work, where they breathe, where they live. Lindsey Graham, who I hate, cannot walk through an airport, right, without citizens and journalists following around, making fun of him, right? But for most people in this country, John Roberts could be standing behind most reporters at a Publix, and they wouldn't know who was behind them, much less have the acumen and accuracy to criticize what he's doing. And you see that in the flag story. You see that in the situation where a Washington Post reporter is there, sees it, and cannot figure out that it's news. So I come at this from a perspective always of how do I basically not be that guy? How do I make people understand that this institution is a co-equal branch to the other three, and is the only branch that is unaccountable to the rest of us. Yeah. And so that's the branch that we should almost be more critical and suspicious of, right?
So there was some talk on a prior panel about interest in history, because a lot of the journalism today is presentism, like being in the present, there's no past. And Elie said something important, and I want to ask you, Ari. How does 2000 bring us to 2016? Yeah. And also the Voting Rights Act. Yeah. There was a silly debate during the Hillary-Obama campaign about who was responsible, the movement or or President Johnson, but also tell us a little bit about the Powell memo, because the right has always understood the power of the courts, and in that memo was a precursor to some of the.
Yeah. So there's a lot in there, but so the 2000 election, when many of you guys probably weren't born.
I know that.
feeling old.
Who was born in 2000?
Oh, wow. Okay,
All right,
so
well, that's it. All right.
that was my first election. So like some of you, I was going through that the first time. It was my first election, and there was a lot of similarities to now.
Yeah.
It was George W. Bush and Al Gore, and a lot of people argued there was no difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore. George W. Bush was running as kind of a compassionate conservative, whatever that meant, a new kind of Republican. Al Gore was running very much as a centrist. There was
a lockbox.
Very kind of boring candidate, establishment candidate. Ralph Nader, there's not really a Nader this time, but there was an independent candidate this time running from the left who basically was arguing that the Democratic Party had become soulless and beholden to corporate interests and didn't stand for anything. So
Like RFK before the brain worm.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So there was a lot of debate on college campuses about what to do.
Right.
You know, do we vote Nader, even though he might just be a spoiler in a two-party system where, unfortunately, for better or for worse, there are only two real choices? Or should we choose a lesser of two evils? Is one evil dramatically worse than the other? And we were wrestling with all these questions. But you know, the interesting thing is, you know, a lot of people did vote for Nader, rightly or wrongly, and Al Gore did lose that election very narrowly. The Supreme Court, in an unprecedented way for the first time in U.S. history, stepped in and stopped the votes from counting in Florida, handed George W. Bush the election, and he won by 537 votes. So you could credibly argue that every person's vote in Florida actually mattered. And what happened was that the two justices that George W. Bush put on the Supreme Court, Sam Alito and John Roberts, were the pivotal votes for overturning Roe v. Wade, for gutting the Voting Rights Act, for Citizens United deregulating the campaign finance system, and so much else. I mean, they would not have been able to do any of these things. The 6-3 majority would not be 6.
Right.
It would be 4, which is not a majority. So it literally was one of the most consequential elections, and a lot of people at the time said, this election doesn't matter. So I just want to keep that. I'm not telling anyone how to vote. I'm not making an argument for any candidate. I'm not defending any kind of party. I'm just saying, keep it in the back of your mind when people say there's no difference between the candidates, voting doesn't matter. We heard a lot of that 24 years ago, and it mattered a lot. Back to your question about history, I think it's so important. I think it's something that Elie and I try to do in all of our stories, is to bring in history, because we can learn so much about it. And that's one of the great things, working at a place like The Nation, working at a place like Mother Jones, doing independent journalism. We really get the time to dig into history. And it takes time. It takes a lot of time. You have to go to the archives. You have to read these dense biographies. For my last book, I read the entire constitutional debates. I would be lying if I said it was always interesting. I would be lying if I said it was always interesting, but there were some really, really interesting moments there that I had never done it before. And so I think we can learn a lot about these things, because what you realize is conservatives have always had a long game. They've always had a long game. They always think beyond the present moment. And in the 1960s, conservatives were losing. They were losing to the civil rights movement, to the women's rights movement. In the span of 14 months, we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Immigration Act of 1965. That transformed American politics. That opened up American politics for the first time to previously marginalized groups, previously marginalized communities. There's a whole story of the Constitution that the fight for American democracy is really about what one historian called the forgotten people, those who were excluded from the protection of the Constitution in 1787. Those people were brought in through the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. And the conservative movement realized they were losing. So there's this amazing memo that was written by Lewis Powell, who was the chief lawyer for the Chamber of Commerce. He later became a justice on the Supreme Court. And he basically said, we're losing. We're losing the media, we're losing universities, we're losing the courts. We need a plan to take over all these things. And in particular, we need to take over the courts, because we can use the courts to do all these unpopular things that we couldn't do otherwise. The Republicans were never going to overturn the Voting Rights Act through legislation.
Through voting.
Yeah, exactly. They were never going to overturn Roe v. Wade through legislation. These things were so popular. They were never going to get rid of it. So it's let's rig these institutions to such a way that then we can take people who are not accountable and we can do all our anti-democratic stuff through that. And that's why I think looking at history is so important. And I know everyone's really, really busy right now, and there's so much going on. But I would just urge you guys, when you're dealing with a story, if you have time, try to peel back and think about how did things become the way they are? And there's always a story behind it, and it usually doesn't start with the present moment. It usually starts 30, 40, 50, sometimes 200 years or more. I mean, Israeli-Palestine can go back a lot longer. But there's always some backstory that can add a lot. And then if you do use that history, you'll have something in your stories that other people don't have.
Right.
With intentionality, the historical documents will always show you that the people who did whatever thing that you're talking about usually meant to. And I think that's one of the things that I think is missing the most from presentism, from current media coverage, is the lack of understanding that the things that we are dealing with, the problems that we face, are problems that are brought to us on purpose. Right? There is a sense in this country, especially in mainstream media, especially on television and radio, that the things that are happening are inevitable. They're inevitable because half the country thinks this way and half the country thinks that way. They're not inevitable. It's not half and half. And the people who have done the bad shit knew what they were doing at the time that they did it. And we're trying to bring about exactly the conditions that we now live under. And so part of that, going to history, peeling back that extra layer, is that it's the Scooby-Doo moment. That's dated. I can't even use that, right? But it's the mustache twirling cartoon villain, right? There's the guy, usually a white guy, at the start of the story who was just if I do it this way, I'll get everything that I want. That literal guy almost always exists. Go find him. Go find him, go expose him, go show how what that guy wanted is actually what's happening. And it will to me, it will help people, I guess the word I'm looking for, it will help people feel not helpless. Because that is, I think, a thing that we have to fight up so much in our current moment. It kind of goes back to Ari's point about the current election. When people are saying both parties are the same, there's no difference, what they're really saying is, what that really is an expression of helplessness. An expression of there's nothing that we can do. There's no other option. We can't fix things. That's why they're saying both sides are the same. They don't know what their own power is. And I find it useful in those moments to be well, who didn't think that? Leonard Leo.
Yep.
He thought there was something he could do about it. Lewis Powell, he thought there was something that he could do about it, right? Lee Atwater, he definitely thought there was something he could do about it. The people who have done the bad things never felt helpless. Yeah.
But I want to come back to that as we close out to questions, but in many ways the nation is an alternative. So you fight against the idea of Tina. There is no alternative. Just a quick story. Many years ago, Eric Foner, who's on our editorial board, a wise historian, emailed me late at night and said, "Does anyone down there know Bernie?" And I said, "Yeah, there are a couple people." He said, "Could you please tell him, stop with Denmark? And could he please start talking about his country's own radical traditions? The Labor Populist Party, the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, the changes that have happened through movements and other ways." So we kind of tried to work that through. But what can people do? We used to joke, I joke about this, but Roosevelt, 4 terms, don't call it court packing, but he did court reform, which is better than that. But Elie, what can we do? Ari, what can we do? If there is a Democratic House Senate, the filibuster, there are changes that could be fought for. And what strikes me, people used to say if only people brought their game to political radio as they do to sports radio, we'd be a better country. But people are learning about some of these inequities.
Yeah. You want to go?
Sure. I'll start with that. Again, from the perspective of us not being helpless, there are always plans. There are always plans of action. There are always different ways to skin the cat. So I think trying to keep it cabled to what can journalists do.
Yeah.
one of the things that I try really hard to do is to normalize progressive ideas, to normalize and make it palatable to see somewhat radical solutions, right? Because what you'll have from a lot of other journalists is basically they're writing their own fear, right? They're like, we can't possibly do that because this would happen, because that would happen. And I try to normalize kind of so if anybody has played football, like if you're like a defensive end in football, what you're doing is setting the edge, right? You're trying to move that Overton window just to the point where people can exist comfortably within new, progressive, sometimes radicalized frameworks. So, example, one of the things that I talk about when I talk about court expansion, I talk about court expansion a lot, have great plans for court reform, and the thing that I get back to me is just like, well, if Democrats expand the court, will Republicans do the same thing, right? Now, a lot of journalists, a lot of people in even my space will respond to that, well, you see, that probably won't happen because, but I don't come at it that way. Well, if Republicans will do the same thing, yes, so, and? Well, if Republicans expand and then Democrats, then Democrats will just spend, yeah. What, you think we're gonna run out of chairs? Tell me I think there should be 29 justices on the Supreme Court. If you think that the Republicans will make 39, I'm gonna say, okay, 59, okay, give me, at what number do you think that it becomes too much? And then let's explore why you think that's too big of a number. We can do the same thing with Congress, right? Congress is at 435 people. Why? That's not particularly representative. We have the least representative democracy amongst democracies in terms of the amount of people our representatives represent, right? One representative in our nation represents about 750,000 people.
And 1%.
Right? In other countries, in Mexico, one person represents 250,000 people. Why can't we be more like Mexico? Well, if you did, and there are various plans. It's like if you did my plan that would kind of tie representation to the lowest state population, we'd have 537 congressmen instead of 435. What's wrong with that? Again, are we going to run out of chairs? Do you think we don't have enough wood? So like when you present things as possible, it's part of getting people over their helplessness is to show them that the ideas, while perhaps not yet popular, while perhaps not yet capable of garnering majorities, are normal-ass ideas. And I'll close with, because that's exactly what the Republicans have done.
Yep.
They have normalized ideas that, from my perspective, are radical and crazy. They have normalized the radical, crazy idea that a state government can legitimately force a person who happens to get pregnant to perform labor for 9 months against her will without pay. That was outlawed by the 13th Amendment, I thought. When we said slavery and forced labor were no longer allowed in this country, but the Republicans have renormalized the idea of slavery and forced labor in the abortion context. And they've done it subtly. They've done it with a velvet glove. So I try to normalize the other thing.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to talk about what you guys can do as journalists and also just what you can do as citizens, because obviously we're both. The first thing I think is, in terms of journalists, just it's at a time when there's so much misinformation and so much disinformation, and it's getting so much worse. I mean, in 2020, Twitter flagged lies about the election, lies about COVID. They flagged those and deleted those posts. Now the people that are doing the most disinformation run the platform. So I mean, and that's the case for everything. So listen, we're old, okay? Someone just asked me yesterday if I wanted to do an Instagram live. And I'm like, people are still doing Instagram lives? Like, we don't know what's going on. We don't know how young people get information. Like, we're not gonna social media explain to you. Like, you guys know it. So the way that you're gonna report is so much more important than how we're gonna report, right? Because a lot of people are not getting, who are your age, are not getting their news from MSNBC.
I'm talking to your mom,
or the
right?
Nation.
Like,
yeah, exactly. You look at the average age of the MSNBC viewer, it's like 70-something. So, I mean, report the news in your authentic way, and your friends are much more likely to read it than what we're doing, just to be totally honest with you. The second thing is find stories that are important but aren't getting covered and need more coverage. And that was how I ended up on the voting rights beat. I noticed way back after the 2010 election that all these states were changing their voting laws in a way that seemed to be a reaction to the first black president to try to manufacture an electorate that was older, whiter, more conservative, as opposed to younger, more diverse, and more progressive. And I thought this was a big story, and it wasn't being covered nearly at all. And so I wrote my first story on this. I thought I was going to do one story about it. It came out first in Rolling Stone, and then I started reporting it at The Nation. And it became a beat at a time that nobody really understood it could become a beat. And I could have said, like, no one else is covering this. I mean, there obviously were certain people, but no one else is covering this. I could just give it up. But it turned out a lot of people cared about it. So you don't want to find something that's so obscure that nobody cares about it. You want to find a sweet spot of it matters. It should matter to more people, but for some reason other people don't know about it. And that's how you'll, especially as a younger journalist, that's how you'll distinguish yourself. Just in terms of what you can do in terms of being a citizen, I would say try to elevate democracy as an issue connected to all the things that people care about. Like I said, if you care about a women's right to choose or a broken criminal justice system or unfair U.S. foreign policy, all those things are an extension of a lack of democracy at home. So I would elevate democracy as an issue and realize this is not a D versus R issue. This is, are you small d Democrat or not? The second thing I would say is question the system as to why it is the way it is. Don't accept it for why it is. Question, why are we the only democracy that allows someone who gets fewer votes to occupy the highest office in the land? Instead of just accepting that the Electoral College is the way it is, ask why it is the way it is. Why do we have these things? Who are they designed to favor? Why were they done in the first place, and what can we do to try to get rid of them? And then the last thing I would say is try to organize locally, because that's where you're going to have the biggest impact, is in your own backyard. I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, in New York, and say, I'm so mad about what's happening in Wisconsin or what's happening in Georgia. I'm going to go down there. And I'm like, New York didn't have early voting until about 2 years ago. And New York's not exactly the most democratic place when it comes to local government. And there's about half a dozen swing districts right in New York that are going to decide control of the House. So you don't have to go to Georgia. You don't have to go to Wisconsin. You can just stay right here.
I live in Westchester. I could use your help. Right?
And have a big issue. And I write at the end of my book about Michigan, which is a seemingly rigged state where people started putting initiatives on the ballot to expand democracy. They began putting initiatives on the ballot to ban partisan gerrymandering, to do things like enact automatic and election day registration to make it a lot easier for young people to be able to vote. And the interesting thing about this is these passed overwhelmingly. These passed with 70% of the vote. These passed in counties that voted for Donald Trump. Democracy is only a partisan issue because we make it one. We don't have to accept that it's a partisan issue. If you go out and you talk to people, people just want the system to be fair. It's become politicized because powerful people want to make it politicized so that you feel like this is something that you can't actually accomplish, to Elie's point.
Can I just,
Please.
Just one more quick thing just on the citizen point, because it's really simple that you all can do. I don't need you to fight Biden v. Trump, right? I don't need you to fight AOC v. Abigail Spanberger. I need you to fight your generation and the couch, right? Because sitting at home on the couch is actually the thing that will cause things to go wrong in your cohort, right? And so one of the easiest things that you can do as a citizen to get young people to vote, and at that point, I don't care who they vote for, because it's gonna work out for me generally anyway, is to make that process as frictionless for your cohort as possible, which means you guys who care enough to come to a conference like this have to be the ones that your friends can go to when they're like, oh, when do I register to vote? You gotta know that.
Yeah.
You gotta have, for your community, for your state, you gotta know. You go to Swarthmore College, oh, well, our voting booth or our polling place is here. And our deadline for registering is there, and you have to do it. But you can vote as early as whatever that, because every state has different rules. You have to be the one to have that knowledge just at the tip of your tongue so you can spread the good word. Because if you make voting, as one of the things that Ari talks about a lot, is how many hurdles we place in front of people to vote for the express purposes of discouraging them to vote, right?
Yeah.
Voter suppression is not all just like taking away law. It's just making it a little bit harder. And so one of the best things that you can do as a citizen is just to make it a little bit easier for the people in your
Totally.
Yeah, and I'll just to add to his point, I mean, when it comes to voting, I mean, clearly Republicans think your vote matters.
Absolutely.
Or they wouldn't be trying so hard to make you not vote. And the last thing I'll say about that is that not voting doesn't give you more power, it just gives someone else more power. And I think even in the best elections, only half of young people vote. And again, you don't want to give people something to vote for. Trying to shame people into voting isn't going to work. But the whole point is that if young people's turnout went from 50% to 60%, let alone 70%,
it's over.
That transforms not just the presidential race, that transforms so many congressional elections, state legislative elections, Secretary of State elections, so many elections. So I think a lot of young people, again, not to young-splain, but I think a lot of young people have so much power they don't even realize. And you guys as leaders in your communities can try to make that message in a way that we're not telling you to do it, but you guys can do it in your own authentic way.
Secular amen. I was going to say, a lot of the money that's come into politics in the last 20, 30 years, right-wing money, is to limit the vote because they're worried about a new generation, the demographic destiny. So they're trying to limit votes of those who might be not lined up. I was going to say one other thing. Ari spoke of the Nader-Gore moment. We came up with something called the Molly Ivins rule. You will not remember Molly Ivins, but she was a great reporter in Texas. If you lived in a state that mattered, vote your head. If you live in a state that didn't matter, vote your conscience, your heart. But that was back when 17 states were in play. Now there's 7 or 8 states, these battleground states. So sadly,
I remember trying to organize on college of this in 2000 vote sharing thing. Like if you lived in Florida and you really wanted to vote for Nader, trying to make it so that like, all right, well you're going to vote for Gore, but then I'll find somebody in New York to vote for Nader to make you fucking right. Didn't work.
I was going to say one last thing before going to questions. I think someone who's come out of this last day moving forward is Alvin Bragg, come out well, because he is there is something, Ari spoke of state legislatures, down ballot races, but he's one of these reform prosecutors. It's tough, but I think that's also important. These secretaries of state, others, and voting for someone is just a first step because you still got to make sure they're held accountable and have the space to do what they promised to do. But anyway.
Yeah, Martin Luther King said, the vote isn't the ball game, it just gets you in the arena.
Right.
Just the first step towards making change.
But want to open it up to questions at the mics. Woo. Do you want to take the first and then Ari can point?
Well, it depends on the question.
Why don't we take a few maybe?
Or we'll try to give shorter answers.
Yeah.
Shorter questions, shorter answers. And would you be willing to identify yourself? You can take undisclosed if you would.
Okay. You guys hear me?
Yep.
I can.
All right, great. So thanks to the panelists. You mentioned the intentionality and careful planning of the bad guys or whatever. Makes me think of a young William F. Buckley founding the National Review. All of a sudden, he's pals with what's his name? Well, Reagan reads it. There's this big epicenter of what became this super powerful conservative movement that reverberated for decades and decades. I'm wondering, do you guys think, what power do you think that media like The Nation still has in this like crazy changing landscape? Because I don't know if we're still in this place where some guy can found a magazine and all of a sudden, so yeah.
Let me just 1 second turn it over. But Reagan, this is hard to imagine or want to say, he was a movement president. And he was willing to give to the people in this movement that National Review was also hitched to more power. So we're witnessing, and we have the next issue of The Nation is about MAGA, Project 2025, which Elie's part of. But you're seeing again the possibility that the Heritage Foundation, which has changed quite a bit, but it was the Mandate for Leadership in the Reagan years, which had all these ideas which Reagan picked up on many of. So we have not had a movement. I mean, there is a, I'm going to turn it to Elie. There are a lot of people in the domestic part of the Biden administration, like antitrust stuff, or the labor movement, NLRB, where there is some movement, but it's still not what Reagan.
So I'll answer that in two ways. First of all, when I started talking about court packing, it was polling at 9%.
Yeah.
And now it's polling at 43%.
Yep.
I can't take all the credit. But like, progress happens, right? Like, just because we haven't gotten over the hump yet, like, you know, things are moving, things are percolating. It's still worth it to yell and scream and bitch and moan, because like there are still people who will listen and who you can try to effectuate change that way. But the other thing I want to say, kind of specifically to your question, is that I think one has to remember that kind of one of the fundamental asymmetries of this battle is that when we're talking about the conservatives, we're talking about a minority population. Mm-hmm. And I know from minority populations, like when you're in the minority, you can really get the sense of like, it is us against the world. If ain't us, nobody is gonna be for us. Like we gotta, you know, circle our wagons because they will take us if we let them, right? That's from a black standpoint, but that's actually also how the conservatives feel because they're small. Right. There aren't actually a lot of them. And I think one of the things I really try to get people to remember is that we are more than them. We are the majority. And so if we just push majoritarian type of solutions, if we get rid of things like the filibuster, if we get rid of these anti-democratic things, they'll lose because they're unpopular, because nobody likes them. There was one over, do you want to go back and forth?
Back and forth.
So I'm really concerned with news accessibility, but in particular for non-English speaking immigrant communities and for system-impacted folks. I work a lot with formerly incarcerated communities as well in LA. And a struggle that I have is like, although we're kind of like speaking in this conference with obviously like journalism students who read the news and stuff, connecting to communities who don't have like specialized knowledge or sometimes really any knowledge of like the American democratic system. And especially because I see these communities, I think, are being specifically targeted with misinformation, disinformation campaigns. What are best practices or like material techniques that you guys use to try to reach those audiences when like explaining these bigger concepts to like a very, like they're just not concerned with the news because they're dealing with other material issues on the daily?
Well, I think one of the problems, I think local, we used to partner with the Ethnic Media Review, which was a network of ethnic media, digital, around the country, particularly San Francisco, Oakland, Brooklyn, New York, and we paired with them on some investigative reporting. But I think investigative reporting that exposes abuses that communities are facing and has some impact could bind people more to those outlets. I think the crisis of local journalism, hyper-local, is something we've been writing a lot about in terms of possibilities at this crisis moment, but really local, go local, and even kind of a hyper-local blog is helpful. There's something, I mean, this is ridiculous, but the West Side Rag is around. It has a lot of readers and it tells people what's coming in, like stores. It tells people advice about how to apply for projects or for jobs. So a combination of libraries, which are under assault too, where people go to for job information, other information, and finding what the local digital possibilities are in a community. That is not a good answer, but there are networks that do work with communities and also formerly incarcerated, there's more attention to in terms of materials coming in that groups specialize in moving. So that's my answer, but.
You gotta meet people where they are, right?
Yeah.
And you have to never discount somebody's concerns because they seem small or unimportant or don't, you know, or aren't really what we should be talking about. Never tell people what they should be talking about. Listen to what they're talking about, and then your job as the journalist, as the advocate, is to connect for them what they are talking about, what they care about, to this thing that you think is important and this thing that they should know about. When I go into the barbershop, which is not often, but when I go, I do not roll in being like, Sam Alito, like that's not gonna work at where I go. There are other barbershops where that might work, not mine, right? My barbershop is the kind of barbershop where the guy comes with the trash bag full of goods and services that one can purchase, right? And the trash bag man, he might have a specific issue that he is worried about that day as he is peddling his wares in my community, right? And if I'm in the chair while he's talking to me about voting for Trump, I'm gonna listen real closely to trash bag man, try to understand why he's saying he's voting for Trump, because most likely trash bag man ain't gonna vote in the first place. I'm going to try to listen to him. I'm going to try to explain why I disagree with his particular position. And I'm not going to be doing it necessarily to convince him. I'm doing it in a way that I'm trying to convince everybody else in the fucking shop that day. That like, oh, well, you like Trump because he gave you a check, right? Like, and he's like, yeah, that big check. Biden gave you a check too. He didn't put on his name on it because he's humble. He's Christian. Biden's a Christian? Yeah, he's Catholic. I thought he was Jewish. No, he's Catholic. Real big Catholic guy. That's why he didn't put his name on the check, though, because he was humble. And the trash bag man's like, oh, I didn't think about that. I'm still voting for Trump, though. Okay, but maybe I got somebody else, is the thought process, right? And so literally, it's that level of kind of like person by person advocacy, right? But you notice in that story, what I didn't do is tell my buddy, you're an idiot, right? I didn't just come at him with like, that's stupid, right? No, you understand what he's saying and you I call people stupid on Twitter. When I'm actually trying to convince somebody in real life, I'm trying to take them where they are, meet them where they are, and get into what I know and my knowledge base through what they know in their knowledge base, right? It's the best I can do.
Let me just say quickly, listening is critical, really important, but there is an asymmetry of audience and publication sometimes. I think of the New York Times, which this extraordinary reporter, Hannah Dreier, she's probably 35, did a story on child labor's come back to America. And a lot of states like that. And that won a Pulitzer, but it's going to be, and it should be reported at different state levels in all ways and built on. But that was a really important piece.
Okay, so hi, I'm Samaya. I'm not
Hi.
actually a student. I'm a student researcher at the CUNY Grad Center.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, so I'm multiracial, right? Like I'm Black, East Asian, and South Asian. I'm also a hijabi, so very Muslim. When I was at Brooklyn Tech, kids actually tried to burn me with cigarettes because I was so vocal about my faith. And I'm very American, right? Like I almost got recruited by the US military and NYPD at CUNY. So my question is, right, I am part of all these diverse communities that are so at odds with each other. How do I write to make them all feel connected to me at the same time?
Why would you want to?
Because I want all of their support and I want them, you know what I mean? Because I'm trying to pass policies related to inclusive school foods. So getting all of their support would be important to me to pass public policy.
Okay, well that's different, right? Yeah. So those are two different goals, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Trying to write in a way that's persuasive to all people is one thing. Okay. Trying to write in a way where they all feel like they can see themselves in you is a completely different thing, right? Okay. And it's the latter goal that you can't actually accomplish, right? And you shouldn't want to accomplish. You don't need to have people personally identify with you in order to make your point. I think part of what I was kind of getting at, part of what you might be hoping for is that if you could just show that you're this and this and this and this and this, that people wouldn't criticize you or feel like you didn't have the right to say what it is you're saying. And I would say to that, fuck that. You know what you know. You have the right to say what you think just as much as anybody else. You don't need the shield of oh, but I'm this, oh, but I'm that, oh, but I'm that, in order to make your point. What you need, and we talked about this again in my small group, what you need is the platform and the expertise to make people feel like there's a reason they should listen to you, right? They're not gonna listen to you because you're this or that or the other. They're gonna listen to you because you have presented yourself as an expert in whatever the hell you're talking about. And if you can present yourself as an expert in whatever the hell you're talking about, that can get their attention. And then you just, with craft and skill, make your persuasive point.
But I disagree a little bit with that, in that you can make an argument and you can emphasize certain things for different communities while still making your essential argument, right? So you might have a slightly different argument for the law and order, police, military crowd than you're going to be making for people that are being persecuted based on their religion, right? You could be making the argument for the same kind of policy, but you could be emphasizing different things. And same thing with voting. You know, if you're talking about challenges to voting, you might emphasize different things for seniors than you're going to talk about for young people. You might emphasize different barriers for urban voters compared to rural voters, depending on where they live. So I do think, and I know you weren't not saying this, but I do think sometimes you have to understand what's going to be the argument that's most effective with that community. And I do think it's good that you have this duality, or even more than duality, in terms of your life experience. That's going to make you a better journalist. And also, one of the most important things in journalism is empathy. I really think that is the most important quality in a journalist, is to understand. We ultimately tell stories. That's what we do. That's why people come to us, is to hear stories. And at least in terms of my writing, it's always so much more powerful to tell a story through a character that's not me, through somebody that's been affected. I could tell someone X, Y, and Z policies are affecting voting rights, and I can tell every kind of statistic. If I tell a story of someone who went through something, it's so much more powerful. So if you can tell a story through the lens of all these different communities, I think that's ultimately another way that people can say, okay, now I see myself in that person. I'm open to that argument that I might not have been open to before.
Okay, gotcha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Ramsey. I'm from Dartmouth. We were talking about elections, and it got me wondering, in your guys' opinion, do you think there's a future in America past the two-party system? And if there is, and if it's something that we should work towards, how should we be approaching that now in the present moment to minimize that for the future?
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult to change in a winner-take-all system, right? Because in Germany, the Greens can get 30% of the vote, and they could get somewhere like 30% of seats, and they might be able to actually be in coalition, right? So you're not playing that kind of spoiler role. Here, the Greens can get 30% of vote, and it doesn't matter at all, because the person that's going to get the most votes is going to win, unless it's how we elect presidents. But so it's hard to imagine. People are thinking about things like ranked choice voting for that reason. So there's less of a worry about being a spoiler. If you can rank your candidates and you can say, okay, well, if I don't get my first candidate, then I can get my second one. And it's less of a lesser of two evils thing. Now, doesn't always produce the greatest outcomes. Eric Adams was elected with ranked choice voting in New York. So, I mean, it's not like the most progressive person always wins. But I think people are starting to think about, maybe we need to try to figure out how to democratize the two-party system more compared to changing our whole system into a parliamentary system, which I think would be good, but I don't see it happening anytime soon.
I was just going to say, like, all of the things that you think you hate about the two-party system are actually things you hate about the winner-take-all system. That's the connection. Like, it's the winner-take-allness of our elections that fuck everything else up, because you cannot, in a winner-take-all system, there's always going to end up being a binary choice, whereas in a representative system, you can have much more room from just much more parties, much more ideas, and that's why Europe is the way it is.
You also need ballot access reform. You need a lot of changes at the national level. But in essence, in the Democratic
Mandatory
Party,
registration?
Yep, which the nation has been campaigning for 50, 60, 70 years. Don't give up. But I was going to say that in essence, we have a Democratic Party that is 3-4 coalitions.
Yeah.
And there's a caucus called the Progressive Caucus, which is now at 100, led by Pramila Jayapal and has Jamie Raskin and others, which is probably closer to some of what we believe in this room or what you're talking about. But you got to break open the system until you can have a real national.
Well, and there's also primaries, and Republicans have used primaries much more effectively than Democrats have to push the party in the direction they want.
And the rules, I mean, it's a terrible thing to talk about rigging today because we heard a lot of it yesterday. But there is a rigged system, but it's just not in the way felon number one claims it.
Hello. Thank you both. Thank you everyone so much for the talk today so far. Building actually on the question of elections and party politics, we talked a little bit about the ruthlessness of the Republican Party, and since the 60s, really just using every nook and cranny possible to gain more and more power. I was interested in seeing the contrast between that and how Democratic politics have kind of evolved the last few decades. There's a saying that I think I would agree with personally about there is a valuing more of the means at the expense of the ends, and how Democrats tend to think about electoral politics. We see things about certain policies that can even get Democrats to be more powerful, like trying to make DC a state or Puerto Rico a referendum. We don't see these aspects really talked about in politics, and we see that a lot of care in Democratic Party is more about the aesthetics of seeming to be the presentable, higher person in the room rather than actually getting effective policies in. So I wanted to ask, this is kind of a two-parter, do you agree with that assessment within the Democratic Party? And if so, what can the role of journalists do to call out that behavior and present an alternative that this is not just the only way or responsibility of politicians to be the behaved person, but also actually get stuff for their constituents?
So, do I agree with that assessment? Kind of. I think what I agree with more is what Krachina said, though. The Democratic Party is actually just 4 or 5 different coalitions. One of those strengths of the Republicans and the conservative is that they're pretty much all the same guy. Right? It's basically they're all the same, basically socioeconomics, trained, raised, bred in a certain way guy, right? And people, and that guy and the people who love that guy, right? Whereas the Democratic Party is really just a bunch of people who wouldn't even like each other, right? Wouldn't even be in the same room with each other, but for their opposition to that guy, right? So like we have the problem, Democrats have the problem of being much more like herding cats, because we are, right? I like to say this about the Supreme Court, right? Where Leonard Leo can tell Republicans who to nominate for the Supreme Court, because all of the other Republican constituencies have ceded court picking to Leonard Leo, right? Religious conservatives, oh, Leo's got the courts. And all right, oh, Leo knows what to do. They're all one guy, right? And I'm smart, and I think about this a lot, let me walk in to the NAACP's office and be like, hey, guys, what's up? I'm gonna pick all the Supreme Court justices. Please give me your suggestions, but I'm gonna do the picking. And if I got the NAACP to agree with me, now I gotta go to the teachers union. Be like, hi. Cheryl and I always gave me her, please give me your suggestions too, Randy. And I will think about them. And then I will pick the Supreme Court justices. Are you cool with that, Randy Weingarten? No, right? This is not gonna happen. So that is the fundamental kind of weakness of the party, but it's also our strength, right? It's also the way that you have to be a coalition builder, and that then gets into your journalism question. Like, you have to show where the coalitions are, and you have to think about it through the lens of coalition building and what have you, as opposed to being able to do it like Republicans, where they can kind of just say like, all right, we're all going to go this way or that way today.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right in the sense that the first thing Republicans think about is how can we rig the system so that there will have more of us, right? And so that we can do all these unpopular things and people won't be able to do anything about it because we'll so have controlled the system. And that's what they did throughout Trump's presidency. And whereas Democrats are, oh, let's just think of the best ideas and then try to convince everyone to support them. But we're still going to be working on this system that Republicans rigged. Mm-hmm. And this is why, I argue from the beginning that voting rights and reforming the system should be the top priority of Democrats, because not only would it help the Democratic Party, it would produce outcomes that would make it more likely to pass all those policies. Right. Instead, Biden tried to do an infrastructure bill, and he did a Build Back Better bill eventually, which had a lot of good things in them. The problem is he's running for re-election. They're running for re-election. They're faced with the same fucked system that they came in with, that they've done nothing to change. Imagine the Republican response if Democrats stole a Supreme Court seat, right? And then blocked someone from being confirmed 8 months before the election and confirmed someone else 8 weeks before the election, 8 days before the election. They would not have come in and buried Supreme Court reform, right? It would have been the only thing they talked about for the entire term was fuck the Supreme Court. They would have done everything they could to change it. Instead, Biden had a commission of a lot of really smart people, put it on C-SPAN.
Not me.
Except for Elie, put it on C-SPAN for a day and then forgot about it.
Yep.
How is that in his interest? And so what I'm saying is, a lot of the times these get derided as process issues, as good government issues. And they try to make it also this kind of elite issue. Like, oh, it's a bunch of like elite white people drinking red wine, you know, and nobody actually cares about these kind of things. And actually, like, the way the system has been rigged leads to a rigging of everything else. Yeah. And that's why, unless you figure out how to unrig the system, you can't unrig politics more broadly. And I think that's why Democrats should prioritize these issues a lot more. And I think the one side understands it and the other side hasn't understood it nearly.
And this is also where so much of the media fails, because they are beholden to the rigged system. They're beholden to the institutions, right? To me, like, the heat death of a journalist, right, is when they become more interested in propping up an institution than telling the truth about the institution that they cover. All right, sorry, I should have said that. When they become more interested in propping up the institution that they cover instead of telling the truth about the institution that they cover. And you see that in my beat all the time. Yeah. You have all the time reporters who are more invested in the pomp and circumstance of the institution of the Supreme Court. They don't want to say anything about how it really works. And that's what, as a journalist, you have to kind of, again, that's the heat death of your career. Because once you become more beholden to what you cover, then you're captured by what you cover, and you can't do good work
And as
anymore.
a journalist, you want to be reporting on the people that are being affected by the policies,
Right.
not cozying up to the people making the policies. No matter what, you might actually agree with the people who are making the policies, but that's only one part of the story.
Absolutely.
And that's the story that most often the New York Times or the Washington Post is telling. People that are making the policies. They're spending a lot less time with the people that are being affected by the policy.
I never want to have lunch. I respect her. I never want to have lunch with Ketanji Brown Jackson. Right? I don't want to know her. I don't want to know any. There's this joke that I have in my family. It's like, I don't like to name the lobsters. All right.
Ooh.
You take me out to a restaurant. I don't want to know what that's Billy. He had hopes and dreams. No, I want Billy buttered on my plate. I don't need to know anything else about him. Right? I don't need to know anything about what Ketanji Brown Jackson sounds like when she laughs. I don't want to know anything about Sonia Sotomayor's grandchildren, right? I had Elena Kagan as a professor, so I know her a little bit, but that's all I need to know, right? I don't want to think of these people as people because I need to cover these people, right? And I might need to be critical of these people. I need to be critical of Jackson after the Colorado ballot access case. I don't want to know who she is as a human, right? Because I don't want to be captured by these people. And that's what I think about the justices I like. You can imagine what I think about ones I don't.
Ellie's just given a wonderfully colorful reply to the problem of access. Don't want to have dinner with. I was going to say one and a half things, though, quickly. There's also the problem, we talked about 2000, Florida. You know, you had this Brook Brothers riot. And then
riot.
Jesse Jackson, who was active then, wanted to do a protest, get some labor unions, do a counter-protest, and he was quashed. And you knew it was all over. You won't know these names, but when Warren Christopher for Gore showed up with a pillow and a knife, and what's his name, Baker. James Baker showed up with a gun, and you knew it was all over. I mean, the toughness is ugly, but they wield it when they need to.
Hi, I'm Alan. I'm a recent graduate of Syracuse University Newhouse School, majoring in media studies. I've read Ellie's work a lot and really admire your work on the Supreme Court. And I'm going to ask a question that is a little incendiary and ideological, which is that what do you think is the fundamental function and position that the Supreme Court should play in our system and in the democratic society? Do you believe that as an institution it can be saved, or it can do something good, or that you believe that it actually cannot because it is a system run by 9 unelected people or politicians in a judge's robe?
Yeah, so I've had a real come to Jesus moment on this, a secular come to Jesus moment on this, if you will, because from law school, I grew up revering the Supreme Court as many people do, as many black people do, right? I come from an activist black ass family, and my mom was born in 1950 in Mississippi, right? So in the segregated South, and we all know that she wouldn't have been allowed to go into a library without the Supreme Court, right? Because Mississippi wasn't going to vote for it ever. And so I kind of came to it with an understanding or a belief that without a powerful Supreme Court, we are lost. And I do not believe that anymore. I do not believe that at all anymore. There's a law professor at Harvard called Nick Bowie who is all about kind of limiting the power and restructuring the Supreme Court so it has less of an impact on our society. And I am like 100% like a convert, right, on that call, because what I've come to understand is how high courts work in other countries, right? So one of the one of the key differences between a liberal and a conservative is that if you walk down the street and you hear another language, like conservatives like mentally are just like, oh, what the hell's that? And liberals are mentally like, ooh, that sounds sexy, right? And I'm that guy. I'm like, I hear another language, I'm like, ooh, tell me more about your foods. So when you actually start to look at other constitutions, start to look at other kind of advanced democracies, nobody has a court like ours. The idea that random ass judges ain't nobody voted for can just tell, no, Angela Merkel, you're not going to do that today. Are you kidding me? That's not how it works in Germany. That's not how it works in South Africa. That's not how it works in Canada. That's not how it works pretty much anywhere else. And so understanding that there's this whole other world, again, South Africa, great example of you want to talk about some people who were worried about racial oppression when they wrote their constitution, go back to the South African rewrite of their constitution. And you know what they didn't do? They didn't put a super powerful, important Supreme Court into its constitution, right? So there are ways that we could move forward as a democracy without having 9 unelected people have a veto power over the other 2 branches of government. So, the kind of technical answer is that the Supreme Court should be there, it should not be life tenured, and it should work on honest conflict of laws, right? Like, Congress says this, but the president says that. Okay, now it's useful to have a Supreme Court. But when Congress and the president have spoken and they're clear, the Supreme Court has no roles. It has maybe more of a role, again, with state courts, right? So Congress says this, but Mississippi says that. Well, now we need a Supreme Court. But except for those actual conflicts, we don't need to give these people a veto power over the elected branches.
The way I think about it is that the role of the courts ideally should be to protect the rights of vulnerable minorities, to do Brown versus Board of Education, right? At a time when it's unpopular, but it's the right thing to do, and the Congress or the president won't do it. I think what the Supreme Court has done more recently and often throughout its history is it's protected the rights of elite and powerful minorities who are trying to rig the system to benefit themselves at the expense of disenfranchised and vulnerable minority groups. So I think that's the core problem with how we think about the courts right now and what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was a liberal love affair for years with the Warren Court. There was a belief that it was a liberal court, and it was in some ways. But the other, quick to the panel, schools are but they're segregated. I mean, the Brown v. Board worked and it didn't work. Do you need movements to accompany the decisions? Because I think is lost.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's one thing that happened is a lot of the left moved institutional, right? And they put their faith in the courts,
Right.
and they put their faith in Congress, and they stopped being part of movements, they stopped being in the streets. And so the civil rights groups today are very institutional, right? And they don't really have a movement behind it. And, I remember listening to Pam Carlin, who was in the Justice Department and is a scholar at Stanford, and I said, why do you think the Supreme Court decided gay marriage a day after they decided the gutting of the Voting Rights Act? And there's a lot of ways to look at it, because you could argue that gay marriage didn't upend structural dynamics in a way that the Voting Rights Act did, but it was still a huge shift for the courts to say, we're going to gut the Voting Rights Act one day, and we're going to allow legalized gay marriage the next day. And what she said is basically the justices respond to people in the streets, meaning that there was a movement behind gay marriage and equality that the justices presumed wasn't there for the Voting Rights Act, and they wouldn't face the same kind of accountability for gutting the Voting Rights Act like they would have faced if they had decided not to legalize gay marriage. I don't know what you think about that argument.
As usual, Pam Carlin is right. she's right about a lot of things. So no, I completely agree with that argument. But I would also kind of, You know, as my mother, again, she's still with us, and one of the worst things about this era for me has been watching her have to watch it.
Oh, wow.
Right? She cries, and she's like, I thought we won. I never thought that my grandchildren would have to fight the battles that I fought. I never thought we would go back to where we are. And watching her be wrong has been hard. But she was wrong. And the reason that she has come to understand, that I have come to understand that she was wrong, is that the forces against us, they never lost, they reloaded.
Yeah.
They retrenched. They didn't disappear. They weren't scared. They weren't like, oh, well, I guess we're all equal now. Gosh darn it. No, they were like, all right, I'm gonna get these people. Maybe I won't be allowed to see it, but my kids are gonna get these people. I'm gonna get them. And I think that that is something that I take with me into my journalism. There is no end state. There is no destination. It is, the struggle, as Melissa Harris Perry says, is real, and it is ongoing. And I am just part of the current step of that struggle. And unfortunately, whereas my mother didn't think her kids would have to fight it, I know my kids will. And I think about preparing them to, at one point, take up their part of the fight. Because there is a relentlessness that is, you know, it's almost it's the concept of entropy, right? Like the universe is trying to fall apart, and it takes a lot of energy to keep it together. That's kind of where we are in this country.
I know you've written about your mother, but I hope you'll write a column about what you just said. One last question.
Lizzie's here. It's always
Hey y'all, my name is Jaden. I minor in political science, and I want to say, Ari, I don't know how, but your book came up on my feed, my Instagram reels 3 times. So congrats on that first. And I have 2 questions.
You say you don't know how the young people think. You got the algorithm.
The second one's going to be a little more heated, so I'll start with the first one. The first one you touched on a little bit with, you're talking about the money in politics, Citizens United, and everything of the sort. I'm wondering, as young journalists, what can we do when we step into the field to start actually putting some accountability into any of these departments, the Supreme Court, the Congress, the presidential, any of these systems? Because I'm thinking back in our history from foundations of American journalism, James Callender and people of that nature, how they fought and how they did things that weren't liked, but they were able to uncover the truths.
Got it. Yeah. It's a really good question. I mean, you have to really dig, you know, especially nowadays. I mean, you have to try to, you know, use public records, use databases, make freedom of information requests, do investigative journalism. And, you know, the one thing, you know, I always say to people is, you know, you can't report over text, and, you know, you can't report over email. You can do some stuff that way. Those are tools, obviously, to reach people, but, you know, you have to go out to places. You have to go to archival libraries. You have to often physically go to places to do these kind of requests. You have to earn the trust of the communities that you're covering, right? Like, I just didn't show up one day and get people to trust me. Like, I built relationships with people by being there a long time. Same with Elie, you know, and making relationships with people, and just observing, you know, and not going in as an expert, but just going in to better understand. So I think the first step is just, it starts with listening, and then it starts with, you know, old school reporting, and then technology has had a lot of bad effects on journalism, but it's also had a lot of good effects on journalism. There's so many databases, so many things that are online now that didn't used to exist in terms of being able to find out information about things and information about people. So I would just urge you to keep digging.
And it does work. That investigative journalism piece does work. I mean, I was making fun of the Washington Post and their handling of the flag story, right? But let's not forget that we're living in a time where, like, our most recent Pulitzer Prize winning reporting just floored the Supreme Court and kind of permanently changed public perception on who these people are when ProPublica went and found out who Harlan Crow was and who was paying for Clarence Thomas's RVs and vacations and Secret Sons and probably hats, right? They went and they found that. That was information that has been, and this is when Ari is saying FOIA requests, this is information that has been available for people to go find since he's been on the court, because the Supreme Court has to disclose what their gifts were, right? The problem was that the Supreme Court reporting bar, people in my field, people who care about what I care about, we would read the disclosure reports and be like, oh, okay. As opposed to being like, I wonder if they're lying. I wonder if they're not telling the truth. Has anybody actually checked? No, but the reason why ProPublica was able to do that is because nobody checked these forms that they were required to fill out every fucking year. And so you saw what happened last year, by the way. Oh, all of a sudden, Alito needed more time. Thomas needed more time to fill out his reimbursement form. Because all of a sudden, he was like, oh shit, people are checking now. Neil Gorsuch, one of the other stories that they did, sold his piece of property just after he got on the Supreme Court. That was all public record. All ProPublica did was take what was publicly available and check, and they won a Pulitzer, which is both an indication of just how low the bar is, right, in terms of reporting, in terms of holding public officials to account. Bob Menendez had gold in his closet. That dude was literally hiding gold bars in his closet. Somebody checked. I'll close with this. My father, same name, interesting guy, passed away. Used to be a politician, resigned in disgrace because he was charged with election fraud, because he committed election fraud. His fraud was...
Finally found it.
His fraud, he was a legislature for in Suffolk County, Long Island. And at some point, he got bored being a legislator. My parents were divorced. He met this new woman. This new woman lived in Florida. He was like, you know what? I'm an old New Yorker. Where am I supposed to go? To my mistress in Florida. So he left. But he still ran for office on Long Island, which is election fraud. He wasn't a resident of the district that he was running in, right? How did this fraud come out? It was a reporter. It was a reporter who went to his house and found that he wasn't living there. The reporter checked. And so sometimes, that's my closing thing, holding public officials to account is actually not hard. Just check. Because a lot of time, they're like my dad, and they're just fucking lying.
Okay, so Breitbart, if you're watching, go to Ellie's vacation house.
I live in my house. I learned that lesson.
So, Elie's going to be writing about his mother and father for the next issue of The Nation. And no, but seriously, thank you for this very, very spirited panel.
Thank you.
And thank you. And Peter, thank you for organizing this event. It's been terrific.
Thank you for that panel. Thank you all for the questions. I'm literally like the only thing standing between all of you and a party, so I'm not going to say very much, but I just want to ask one question. Could I see a quick show of hands for anyone here who's published an article with The Nation, Student Nation before?
Wow, that's great.
All right, that's pretty good. That's definitely more than the last time we did. So one of our goals, one of our goals really is to vastly increase that number. So again, we're really grateful for all of you who have done the work. It's been terrific. I mean, Katrina and I talk more about the Student Nation stuff than anything else for real. So again, we're very proud of all of you who raised your hands, but we do hope that in the next few months, far more of you can raise your hands as well. So next week we'll be in touch. We'll send you links to the videos of everything you've seen today. We'll send you information on the Nation internship, how to write for Student Nation, how to be engaged in our community, how to take action on all of the things Elie and Ari were talking about. We'll send you info on how to buy Ari and Elie's books if you didn't happen to get a free copy today. We'll also put you in touch with everyone. Every speaker, I really think every single one has been not just generous with their time, but really wants to connect, really was pleased to be here, was really impressed with all of you. So they're all willing to kind of keep engaged, keep in contact. So we'll send you info on how to get in touch with people. If anyone heard something today they'd like to follow up on, we're going to make every effort to allow you to do that. So we want you to be in the Nation family. All of you are really important to us. We hope we showed that today. We really value what you said and what you did. So hopefully you will stay in touch. We want to stay in touch with you. And the measure of the success of this conference is not just the time you had today, but it's how we stay in touch, how you all stay in touch. the work you do, the way you support and nurture each other, really is going to be the kind of measure of how successful today was. So again, let us know how we can help, and let's go up to the party.
Great.